Your grandmother told you the family was Black Dutch, dark hair, olive skin, cheekbones carved like stone. She said it with quiet confidence, like it settled something. You believed her. Generations believed her. And for 200 years, an entire population of Americans built their identities on that story, repeating it at dinner tables, writing it on genealogy forms, passing it down like a sacred heirloom. But here's the question nobody wanted to ask. What if the story was never about heritage? What if it was a code? What if Black Dutch was not an identity, but an escape route? There's a silence in American history that has never been properly explained. It lives in census records that change without explanation. It hides inside surnames that do not match the faces carrying them. It whispers through family legends passed down in Appalachian hollows, through old Virginia farmhouses, through the hill communities of Tennessee and North Carolina. Legends told with conviction, told with love, and told, it now appears, with an urgency that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. The term is Black Dutch. 2 words. Seemingly simple, seemingly self-explanatory. And yet, when you pull on this thread, what unravels is not just a genealogical curiosity. What unravels is one of the most complex, most deliberately constructed identity systems in American history. A system built not by historians or politicians, but by ordinary families who understood that in their world, the wrong label could cost them everything. Their land, their freedom, their children, their lives. The most common designation of Black Dutch refers to Dutch immigrants to New York who had swarthier complexions than most other Dutch. That is the surface answer. That is what the textbooks say when they bother to mention it at all. But read that again. A swarthier complexion. That was the entire explanation offered to millions of Americans whose family trees simply do not add up, whose DNA now tells stories the official records refuse to contain. The surface answer was always meant to be the final answer. It never was. Let us go back further, much further. Because this story does not begin in Appalachia. It does not begin in the colonial South. It begins in the Netherlands in the 16th century, in the middle of a war that would reshape the entire Western world. A war that nobody today connects to a group of dark-skinned families living in the mountains of eastern Tennessee 300 years later. But the connection is real, and it is direct, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. One prominent European-only explanation for the Black Dutch label attributes it to Dutch immigrants arriving in colonial New York during the 17th century, who displayed swarthier complexions than the typical fair-skinned Northern European settlers, likely resulting from regional genetic variations or intermarriages within Europe, such as with Spanish personnel during the 80 Years' War, 1568-1648, when parts of the Netherlands fell under Spanish Habsburg control. The 80 Years' War, a conflict that lasted 8 decades, that consumed the Netherlands under Spanish military occupation, and that left behind a population whose bloodlines were permanently altered by that occupation. Spanish soldiers, Mediterranean traders, Moorish influences filtering north through the Iberian Peninsula and into the Low Countries. The Dutch were never the homogeneously pale, blue-eyed people that later mythology made them out to be. They were a port civilization, a trading empire, a crossroads, and crossroads, by their very nature, do not stay pure. But here's where it gets more complicated, because the Spanish soldiers were not the only ones arriving in the Netherlands during this period. Sephardic Jewish merchants came to the Netherlands from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century after being expelled from those nations. Think about what that means. An entire population of expelled people, dark-haired, olive-skinned, Mediterranean in appearance, arriving in the Netherlands, integrating into Dutch society, intermarrying, establishing themselves as merchants, traders, intellectuals, navigators. These were the people the Inquisition had hunted across Spain and Portugal. These were the people who had survived by disguising their identities for generations already. And now they were in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, in the Dutch port cities, and eventually they were on ships crossing the Atlantic to the New World. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews started emigrating from Portugal and Spain, settling throughout areas of Western Europe and non-Iberian realms of the colonial Americas, mostly Dutch realms, including Curaçao and the Dutch West Indies, Recife and Dutch areas of colonial Brazil, and New Amsterdam, which later became New York. New Amsterdam, which became New York, which became the entry point for an entire category of people who would eventually scatter across the American continent, carrying the same dark features, the same ambiguous complexions, and now a new label, Black Dutch. This is not chaos, this is a pattern. And what makes that pattern extraordinary is what happened next, because the Sephardic Jewish migration, the Spanish-Dutch intermarriage, the Mediterranean bloodlines filtering into Northern European colonial families, all of that accounts for only one thread of the Black Dutch story. There is a second thread. And this one is darker. This one is American. This one involves a kind of desperation that no amount of historical distance makes comfortable to examine. In historical American records, Individuals and families of mixed European, Native American, and occasionally African descent adopted the Black Dutch label as a racial euphemism to conceal non-European ancestry and facilitate passing as white. Read that slowly. Adopted the label. Conceal non-European ancestry. Facilitate passing as white. Because in America, from the earliest colonial period onward, being identified as anything other than white was not simply a social inconvenience. It was a legal catastrophe. It determined whether you could own land. It determined whether your marriage was recognized by law. It determined whether your children would be free people or property. It determined whether armed men would come to your door and take everything you had built. The stakes were not abstract. They were absolute. And so families made a choice. A quiet, deliberate, generationally maintained choice. They looked at their dark hair, their olive skin, their features that did not match the Anglo-Saxon norm. They reached for a label that would explain those features without triggering the racial laws that governed their world. They called themselves Black Dutch. They told their children they were Black Dutch. They told their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren until the original reason for the label was buried so deep beneath layers of family mythology that the people carrying it no longer remembered what it had originally been designed to hide. What most people are not seeing is this. The Black Dutch label was not a single thing. It was a system. A remarkably effective, remarkably consistent system of identity management deployed simultaneously by multiple completely different groups of people, all of whom arrived at the same solution because they were all facing the same problem. And the problem was America's rigid, violent, legally enforced racial hierarchy. The label has been applied variably, sometimes as a 19th century ethnic slur against Pennsylvania Germans by Anglo-Americans, and in other cases as a self-applied euphemism among Appalachian groups like the Melungeons to emphasize European roots amid strict racial categorizations that penalized non-white heritage. The Melungeons. This is where the story enters its most dramatic chapter, because the Melungeons are the community through which the Black Dutch mystery can be most clearly understood, and it is through them that modern DNA science delivered its most unexpected verdict. In the shadowy hills where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina meet, a unique group of people has quietly woven their thread into the intricate tapestry of Appalachia. These people are known as the Melungeons, and their origins have been the subject of curiosity, mystery, and debate for centuries. The Melungeons are descendants of a diverse group of people with mixed ethnic ancestry. For generations, the Melungeons themselves offered various explanations for their origins. Some claimed Portuguese descent, some pointed to Turkish ancestry or Romani roots, or even a connection to the lost colony of Roanoke. These were not random fabrications. These were stories chosen carefully, stories that placed the family's dark features within a European or at least respectable Old World framework, safely distant from the African and Native American ancestry that the racial laws of their time would have used to strip them of everything they possessed. Appalachian legend describes a mysterious, multi-ethnic population of exotic, dark-skinned rogues called Melungeons, who rejected the outside world and lived in the remote, rugged mountains in the farthest corner of northeast Tennessee. The allegedly unknown origins of these Melungeons are part of what drove this legend and generated myriad exotic origin theories. The mystery was not accidental. The mystery was the point. When your survival depends on ambiguity, you cultivate ambiguity. You tell stories that are elaborate enough to seem plausible, exotic enough to seem romantic, and vague enough to be impossible to disprove. The Melungeons were extraordinarily good at this. They had to be. And then, in the 21st century, the DNA tests came. The study found the truth to be somewhat less exotic. Genetic evidence shows that the families historically called Melungeons are the offspring of sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin. And that report, which was published in April in the peer-reviewed journal, doesn't sit comfortably with some people who claim Melungeon ancestry. There were a whole lot of people upset by this study, lead researcher Roberta Estes said. Of course they were upset. Because what the DNA revealed was not just an ancestral origin. What it revealed was that the stories had been working. The stories had been so thoroughly believed by the families themselves, by their neighbors, by the census takers and the land record officials and the legal system, that the truth had been successfully buried for 200 years or more. The DNA test did not simply answer a genealogical question. It exposed the architecture of a cover story that had been operating continuously, invisibly, and effectively across multiple generations of American life. But here is where it gets worse. Because the Melungeons were not an isolated case. They were not a unique community that had stumbled upon an unusual survival strategy. They were representative. They were one documented example of something that was happening across a vast swath of American territory, in hundreds of communities and thousands of families, most of whom were never studied, most of whom were never documented, and most of whom are today walking around with a family story about Black Dutch ancestry, and a DNA result that tells a completely different story. It was, more than anything, a survival strategy, especially in places where being black or Indian meant fewer rights or more danger. Genealogists and anthropologists have documented triracial communities, groups descended from African, indigenous, and European ancestors who intermarried and formed distinct, often isolated populations. Triracial communities. The academic term is clinical, almost sterile. But what it describes is something profoundly human. People from 3 different worlds thrown together by the violence and chaos of colonial America, finding each other in the margins, building lives in the spaces the official society did not bother to map, and creating a new kind of people that the racial categories of the time had no framework to contain. Pre-1870, people of color were often unnamed or uncounted in official records. Labels like mulatto, free person of color, or Indian shifted depending on the census taker. Some families moved frequently to avoid persecution or reclassification. Others passed as white, erasing generations of history in the process. This is the mechanism by which history disappears. It does not disappear through dramatic acts of erasure. It disappears through census takers who looked at a family and made a judgment call. Through families who moved to the next county before the record keeper arrived. Through children who grew up knowing to say Black Dutch when a stranger asked about the complexion, and never knowing the original reason why. According to informed sources in the genealogical research community, the scale of this phenomenon is almost impossible to overstate. Researchers estimate that the number of Americans carrying African or Native American ancestry who are today classified in official records as entirely white, because their ancestors successfully made the racial transition through strategies like the Black Dutch label, runs into the millions, not hundreds of thousands, millions. These are people whose family stories were so completely rewritten that the rewriting has never been detected except through the one tool that the 19th century had no way to anticipate: a small vial of saliva in a laboratory that can read the molecular history written inside every human cell. Recent DNA studies from the University of Groningen, 2023, revealed that early inhabitants of the Netherlands had dark skin and blue eyes. This shows that early Northern Europeans were not originally pale, making historic descriptions of swart or dark Dutchmen plausible rather than exceptional. This finding adds an entirely new dimension to the story, because it means that even the apparently simplest version of the Black Dutch explanation, the one about dark-complexioned Dutch immigrants who were simply naturally swarthy because of their European regional genetics, is true in a way that nobody previously understood. The early Dutch were not pale. The melanin was there before the Sephardic migrations, before the Spanish soldiers, before the colonial trade routes. The darkness was original, and what that means is that the label Black Dutch, in its earliest applications, was describing something real, and that realness became the perfect camouflage for something the label's later users needed desperately to hide. This is not coincidence. This is a story about how one factually grounded term was systematically repurposed into a shield. And this is where everything changes, because the Cherokee connection has never been fully integrated into the Black Dutch narrative in popular history, and it is arguably the most historically documented and legally precise use of the label in American history. In the southeastern United States, particularly among Cherokee communities during the 1830s, individuals of Native American descent adopted the Black Dutch label as a passing strategy to claim European ancestry and circumvent the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which mandated the relocation of tribes to territories west of the Mississippi River. This tactic enabled lighter-skinned or mixed individuals to register as non-Indians on censuses or land documents, allowing them to retain property and avoid the Trail of Tears marches that displaced over 16,000 Cherokee between 1838 and 1839. 16,000 people displaced. And those who escaped that displacement, who stayed in their homes, who kept their land, who preserved their families, many of them did so by looking a census taker in the eye and saying, "We are Black Dutch. We are European. We are not subject to your removal order." Think about what that means. Think about the specific, precise moment in which a person, perhaps a light-skinned Cherokee man or a woman of mixed Cherokee and European ancestry, looked at the legal machinery being assembled to destroy their world and understood that the only tool available to them was a lie. Not a lie born of cowardice, a lie born of perfect, desperate clarity, a lie that worked, a lie so effective that their descendants are today in the category of white Americans, who discover, when they finally take a DNA test, that they have 5%, 10%, 15% Native American ancestry that the family records show no explanation for. The real story is this. The Black Dutch label was America's most widely deployed racial camouflage. It was used by Sephardic Jewish families to pass as Christian Europeans. It was used by mixed-race Appalachian communities to pass as white. It was used by Cherokee individuals to pass as non-Indian. It was used by the descendants of African and European unions to claim a European identity at a time when African ancestry meant the legal erasure of personhood. And it was used so consistently, so broadly, and so successfully that it created an entire demographic category. Millions of Americans, whose documented history and genetic history do not match. By 2025, breakthroughs in historical research, genealogy, and advanced DNA sequencing finally revealed the truth. High-resolution DNA sequencing allowed scientists to pinpoint when African and indigenous ancestry entered the family lines, mostly in the late 1600s to mid-1700s. The late 1600s to mid-1700s, the founding period of American colonial society, the moment before the racial laws fully hardened, the window in which black and white indentured servants worked side by side, in which Native Americans and European settlers intermarried in frontier communities, in which the categories were still fluid enough that people could navigate between them, and some of those people, seeing the walls being built around them, chose to step to the white side of the line before it became impossible to cross. Estes and her fellow researchers theorized that the various Melungeon lines may have sprung from the unions of black and white indentured servants living in Virginia in the mid-1600s, before slavery. Before slavery. This is a critical phrase that most people have never sat with. Before slavery as a codified, heritable, permanent legal institution, there was a brief period in American colonial life in which the racial categories we now treat as ancient and immovable were still being invented. African people and European people worked the same fields under the same indentured contracts. They lived in the same conditions. They formed the same bonds. They had children together. And those children, born into a world that had not yet fully decided what to do with them, sometimes found a path. And sometimes that path required a new name. Black Dutch. What the DNA is now revealing, family by family, household by household, across tens of millions of Ancestry, DNA, and 23andMe profiles, is the quiet aftermath of those choices. Many DNA testers are discovering West African, Native American, or Southern European ancestry that aligns with these stories, and it's not uncommon for a Black Dutch family line to trace back to documented free black or triracial communities. Not uncommon. Which means it is happening every day, in living rooms across America, when someone opens their DNA results expecting confirmation of the European heritage their family always claimed, and instead finds a breakdown that does not fit the story. West African ancestry, indigenous markers, Sephardic Jewish heritage, a mixture that the family narrative had no room for, because the family narrative was engineered to exclude exactly these results. According to informed sources within the genetic genealogy community, the psychological impact of these revelations is not trivial. People do not simply update their mental files and move on. They go back to the grandmother who told them the Black Dutch story and understand for the first time that the grandmother may not have been telling a family history. She may have been repeating a protection, a layer of identity armor so old that she herself no longer knew it was armor. The lie had become the truth for her. She believed it completely. And the DNA test did not expose her as a liar. It exposed her as the descendant of someone who had once understood the difference between survival and honesty and had chosen survival without apology. These stories aren't just folklore. They are evidence of erasure, of how racial categories shaped family narratives, and of how people protected their children by reshaping their own identities. This is the sentence that reframes the entire history, because there is a version of this story that frames the Black Dutch label as deceptive, as a lie that people told to gain advantages they did not legitimately possess. But that framing requires us to accept the racial hierarchy that made the label necessary as a neutral backdrop. It requires us to treat the laws that stripped people of rights based on their ancestry as a reasonable baseline, and the circumvention of those laws as a moral failure. The real moral failure was the system. The people who called themselves Black Dutch were not perpetrating a fraud. They were surviving a fraud. The fraud of a society that divided people into categories, and then used those categories to determine who deserved to live fully and who did not. They looked at that system and they found the one tool available to them. A word, a phrase, a label with just enough factual ambiguity to function as a door. And here's the dimension of this story that has never been properly examined in mainstream discourse. What happened to the communities that did not have access to that door? The ones who were too dark to claim the label credibly. The ones whose features made the Black Dutch story unconvincing to the people who had the power to enforce the categories. Those communities did not pass. They were assigned to the racial underclass, and that assignment had consequences that compounded across generations, in wealth accumulation, in educational access, in land ownership, in every metric of material well-being that American society tracks. The families that successfully used the Black Dutch label, and the families that could not have used it even if they had tried, are now, in the 21st century, on dramatically different sides of the American racial wealth gap. Not because of different merit or different effort or different intelligence, because one group's great-great-grandmother looked plausible when she said Black Dutch. Over 19% of black males passed for white at some point during their lifetime between 1880 and 1940. Passing was accompanied by geographic relocation to communities with a higher percentage of whites, and occurred the most in northern states, 19%. Nearly 1 in 5 Black American men in that period made the crossing, moved, renamed themselves, rebuilt their identities in a new location where no one knew their history. And the ones who succeeded completely left no trace in the official record. The only way to find them now is through the DNA, which does not recognize geographic relocation, which does not honor the new surname, which does not care about the family story. The molecule is indifferent to the narrative. What the current wave of direct-to-consumer genetic testing has done is create the first situation in human history where the molecular record and the documentary record are being systematically compared at mass scale. Millions of people are now in possession of their genetic results, and millions of those results are not matching the family stories. The surnames are European. The DNA is not. The census records say white for 6 generations. The genome says something more complicated. And for the families carrying the Black Dutch tradition specifically, the DNA is being particularly revealing. The existence of Black Europeans in colonial America isn't a myth. They were real Europeans, Dutch, German, Flemish, Swiss, whose darker complexions earned them color-based descriptors like swart, swarthy, or black. Their presence reveals how fluid and relative the concept of race was before it ossified in the 19th century. Before it ossified, that is the key phrase. There was a period, roughly the late 1600s through the early 1800s, when the racial categories had not yet fully hardened, when a dark-complexioned person could exist in the American social space with some ambiguity intact, when the question of who you were was still partially answerable with a story. And then the categories hardened. The legal definitions became precise. The census became a racial instrument. The skin color became a verdict rather than a description. And when the categories hardened, the families who had been living in ambiguity made their final choices. Some went into the Black Dutch story and stayed there. Some moved north and simply stopped being known as anything other than white. Some retreated further into the mountains, into the isolated Appalachian communities where the census taker rarely came, and the local community had learned to leave the question of heritage politely unanswered. The Black Dutch survive today in the hearts of many of the southern Appalachian Hill people, a proud people with an elusive spirit who had to hide out, go underground, and conceal their identity to live. To live? Not to prosper, not to maintain social status. To live. The stakes were always exactly that stark. This was never simply about genealogy or ethnic pride or family tradition. This was about the physical survival of actual human beings in a society that had made certain kinds of ancestry into a death sentence. Social, legal, and sometimes literally physical. The Sinti connection adds yet another layer that most people discussing Black Dutch heritage completely miss. Gypsies from Germany, whom some researchers refer to as chickeners, Pennsylvania German from the German Zigeuner, sometimes refer to themselves as Black Dutch. The Romani people, arriving in German-speaking territories, moving into the Pennsylvania German communities, carrying their own set of features that marked them as different, as dangerous, as subject to persecution, they too reached for the same label. Black Dutch. European enough to provide cover, dark enough to be plausible, a word that had become a shelter for everyone who needed shelter from the same storm. What is extraordinary is not that all these different groups reached for the same label. What is extraordinary is that the label worked as well as it did for as long as it did. That a 2-word phrase, Black Dutch, carried enough semantic ambiguity, enough factual foundation, enough social currency in the communities where it was used to protect people across 2 centuries and dozens of distinct ethnic and racial backgrounds. The phrase worked because the Netherlands had genuinely produced dark-complexioned people. It worked because the Spanish occupation was historically documented. It worked because the term Dutch had become thoroughly confused in American usage with Deutsch, German, opening an entire second population as cover. This easily anglicized into Dutch, and both German and Dutch immigrants became known by the same designation. The Pennsylvania Dutch are the descendants of German immigrants. The confusion was not a bug. The confusion was a feature. The more the term meant, the more people it could cover. The broader the umbrella, the more people could stand under it. And now, in 2025, with tens of millions of Americans having processed their DNA through commercial genetic testing services, that umbrella is being lifted for the first time in centuries. The results are not always welcome. The results are not always simple. It doesn't mean your ancestors were lying. It means they were surviving. That sentence contains more moral clarity about American racial history than entire volumes of academic scholarship. It does not excuse. It does not romanticize. It simply places the choice to say Black Dutch, to sign the census form as white, to move to the next county and start again, in its actual context, not as a moral failing, as a human response to an inhuman system. The DNA test cannot tell you what your ancestor felt when they made that choice. It cannot tell you whether they felt grief at the identity they were leaving behind, or relief at the danger they were escaping, or some combination of both that does not have a clean name. What the DNA can tell you is that the choice was made, that it was made successfully, that it was maintained across generations by people who perhaps gradually forgot that it was a choice, who came to believe the story because the story had been told so consistently and so lovingly that it had become the only story they knew. And now, here you are, with a DNA result in your hand, and a grandmother's voice in your memory saying quietly, with complete certainty, "We are Black Dutch." She was not wrong. The family was Black Dutch, in the deepest possible sense. Not because the Netherlands was their origin, but because Black Dutch was the name they wore when the world they were born into made it impossible to wear any other. The question that remains unanswered, the question that the DNA opens rather than closes, is what obligation, if any, these revelations carry. What does a family do with a history that was deliberately obscured? What does it mean to discover that the racial identity you have carried your entire life was constructed, not by genetics, not by culture in any organic sense, but by a specific act of strategic identity management performed by an ancestor who understood the consequences of the alternative? Do you reach back across the erasure and claim what was hidden? Do you reach out to the communities whose history your family's history intersects with in ways that were never acknowledged? Or do you simply hold the information quietly the way your ancestors held their secret, understanding that some truths are complex enough that their full weight can only be carried in private? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that millions of American families are now living with in the wake of a wave of DNA revelations that has not yet crested. The databases are growing. The matching algorithms are improving. The ability to trace specific ancestry through shared genetic segments is becoming more precise every year. The secrets that survive 200 years of paper record management are not going to survive another decade of molecular analysis. What most people are not seeing is the scale of what is coming, because the Black Dutch story is not the end of this process. It is the beginning. Every family legend that explained away dark features with a convenient European cover story is now subject to the same scrutiny. Every genealogical mystery that was resolved by a strategically applied ethnic label is now open again. The DNA does not forget. The DNA does not accept the cover story. The DNA has been waiting, patient and indifferent, carrying the true record of every union, every crossing, every choice made in fear or in love or in both, across every generation since the original decision was made to become someone else. The real story of the Black Dutch is a story about the violence of racial categorization and the remarkable human ingenuity that responded to that violence. It is a story about the lengths to which people will go to protect their children. It is a story about the words we use to survive and the way those words, repeated often enough, become the thing they were originally meant only to impersonate. Your grandmother believed it. Her grandmother taught her to believe it. And somewhere, at the beginning of the chain, 4 generations back, 6 generations back, 8 generations back, there was a person who knew exactly what they were doing and why. A person who looked at a world that had decided to define them, to confine them, to use the circumstances of their birth as a weapon against them, and who picked up a 2-word phrase like a stone from the riverbed and used it precisely and deliberately to hold the door open just long enough for their children to get through. That is not a small thing. That is not a shameful thing. That is, in the most literal sense, an act of love that crossed centuries without ever being acknowledged. And now, finally, the DNA has named it. What that naming will do to American identity, to the racial categories that still shape opportunity and power and belonging in this country, to the families who discover that the story they were told was a shield rather than a history, that is still unfolding. The results are still coming in. The matches are still being made. The ancestors are still being found in the molecular record, waiting to be recognized by descendants who were told, very firmly, very lovingly, to look somewhere else. The question now is not who the Black Dutch were. The DNA has answered that. The question is what we do with the knowledge that the America we thought we knew, the America of clean racial categories and documented bloodlines and families who were simply what they said they were, never existed. It was always more complicated. It was always more human. It was always more desperately, heartbreakingly mixed than the official record was willing to hold. And somewhere in that complexity, in that mixture, in those desperate and loving choices made in the mountains of Appalachia and the farmlands of Virginia and the port cities of colonial New York, is the true origin story of a country that has never been able to fully look at itself. Perhaps now it finally has to.